Hello, guys. My name is Johnny Zamora, and I'm going to be talking about the seven factors or some factors about the American Revolution. And I want to start by saying that I think that the colonies had to get their independence. That the great between Great Britain and them there was no compromise. That they weren't seeing eye to eye on anything. So we had to get our independence. The American Revolutionary War had to occur. So let's start off by saying the 7 Years' War. That was the Great Britain's term for it. The colonial people called it the French and Indian War. So the conflict began during 1754, and it consisted over the land of the Ohio Valley. Virginians, Pennsylvanians were claiming that land, and the French and Indians were already living there. The war spread out to 1756, and it encompassed much of the European, the Caribbean, and even India. The American colonists, they experienced 10 years of warfare, not seven, and that's why they call it the French-Indian War. The French and the Indians, they would trade. I guess you can say they were trading partners with each other. And one of the first battles was caused because of Mingo chief. He led a detachment of George Washington's men to a French encampment in the woods because George Washington's older brother and another man were the ones that started the Ohio Company. So another factor is the Proclamation of 1763. So George III, he came into the British throne, and he was very, I guess you can say, he didn't have a lot of experience with how to rule a country. And there was a tutor by the name of Earl of Bute, and he entitled him, to be part of the creation of the proclamation. So one significant decision of the proclamation was to keep a standing army in the colonies during and after the French Indian War, and it was mostly to keep peace between the Indians and the colonies. And when they were going to keep a standing army, it was meant financially and politically speaking. So throughout the years, the French, they basically, you can say, they abandoned the Indians. So the chief of the Otuda tribe, they attacked British garrison, and it was near Detroit. So the British government, they issued the proclamation, which says that it forbidded the colonies to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And in doing so, it limited trade with Indians. They limited the trade between Indians and licensed traders by colonial governors, and it forbidded private sale of Indian land. It was impossible to enforce because the population was basically settled in the Appalachian Mountains, well, the land around it. It's because the Ohio Company itself was established there, and the colonial people weren't going to lose opportunities to profitable land and land grants and stuff like that. And one of the biggest effects that the proclamation had was that the standing army, it caused concern for Native Americans, for Western settlers, Eastern speculators. So it caused a big concern amongst everyone. Another factor would be the Revenue Acts, which is all the taxes that they had, taxation without representation. The George III, he was looking for prime ministers to, I guess you can say, take care of that situation. So he elected Sir George Grenville. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing things wrong, but sorry. He was the prime minister from 1763 up to 1765. So one of the first acts that he imposed was the Sugar Act. So it lowered the duty of French molasses to 3 pence, and it would make, they did that so they would, the sugar would seem more attractive for from seem more attractive for the shippers themselves to obey the law. And it also raised penalties for smugglers, the people who were smuggling sugar in and out of the country. And another act was the Stamp Act, and it was a stamp must be in any official document, and the stamp would also, it was a tax on the document, and the stamp referred to the that you actually paid for the tax. And Grenville, with all these taxation acts, it was on his side. It was an attempt to raise revenue and like to raise money. So it wasn't so much for the greater good of the people. And like it would lead to confrontation, as we all know, the American Revolution. And on the British point of view, it was reasonable that all those taxation acts was reasonable, but on the American colonial people's point of view, it appeared to be a disturbing action. That on colonial practices, they're putting in all that work, but yet they're getting taxed. And so, if the Grenville would have thought of like the greater good of the whole big picture, since he didn't do that, we had the war. Another situation or like factor of the American Revolution was the Boston Massacre. So around 1768, more than 2,000 British soldiers, came to Boston to occupy it. So March the 15th, 1770, there's 8 British soldiers, and they were guarding the customs house. And there was a crowd that they were throwing rocks at them, and encouraging them to fire, to I guess you can say they were taunting them, until one of them actually did. So moments pass by, and someone else, yells fire. And those 8 soldiers, they shoot into the crowd. They wound about 11 men, and they actually end up killing five men. John Adams and Josiah Quincy, they were attorneys of the British soldiers, but they also were directly connected with the Sons of Liberty. So it kind of seemed like, oh, why are you guys defending the British? But it was but one of the biggest reasons why they did that was to show that, the colonial people were being professional, that, everyone here was being fair, because they had a fair trial, to trial. So in the end, there wasn't any justice. No one was really, as you can say, responsible for the Boston Massacre. Like to this day, there's no oh, did the British do it or did the colonial people did it? So so that raised some anger amongst the people. Hence why we wanted our independence. So one of the other ones is the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act, the colonial people had to buy taxed British tea, and the colonial people were also smuggling in Dutch tea. It's about 100 to 150, maybe 200 men. They would disguise themselves as Native Americans, and they dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the harbor, and while everyone was watching. So John Adams said that an act like this, so rebellious or so big, was going to have great consequences, which meant the war. So also, the whole act itself, it served as a reminder of the Parliament's power to tax the colonies. And there was 3 ships that had that tea. Then they didn't unload the tea. So I'm like, if you're supposed to trade with the colonies, why weren't you doing it? So it angered the colonial people. So one of the 2 main battles, factor battles, as you can say, were the battles of Lexington and Concord. So it was between the winter of 1774 and 75. The optimists of the war, of the battles, they were hoping to repel the 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 Corbière Acts, and the pessimists, they wanted the stockpiles of arms and ammunition. So a British general, he was, sending letters to Great Britain saying that he needed a reinforcement and like to send in more troops. And he also suggested that Great Britain should repel the Corbière Acts. But the Britain, they didn't want to seem like failures. They didn't want to repel the those taxation acts. So that's why those battles occurred. So Povermue and William Dawes, they were riding to Concord to warn the militiamen that the British were coming, and it and while on their way to Concord at Lexington, the militiamen were confronted the British soldiers, and so they there's like those few battles go on, and in the end the British, they end up failing to find the arms and the ammunition that they were looking for, and the American colonies, the colonial people, they failed to stop the British raiding. And April 19, 1775, the war had begun, the American Revolutionary War. So if the British didn't know exactly that fort of arms and ammunition, they were just being so, they had a high ego that the Britain didn't want to repel those acts. So, our independence was needed. We needed to get detached from Great Britain. So there's another topic called the end of solitary neglect. It's basically like the Navigation Acts were an attempt to end the period of solitary neglect, but they weren't enforced hard enough. So basically, it didn't end anything. The neglect was still going on, and then it wasn't until, and it continued until like the end of the 7 Years' War. The imperial authority, Great Britain's authority, assist the power that, like, it had that power, right, to assist the colony, but they didn't. The colonials they ended up having to govern themselves. So they didn't care anymore about what was going to go on. Like, I guess, like, the aftermath of their actions at that moment. So, what did the colonial people do? They started, thinking more for themselves now that, they're obviously not going to come to some kind of common ground. So we had to start governing ourselves. And another thing that reinforced that thought that we had to get our own independence was the Olive Branch Petition. It was a letter to the King George III, the one who was so insecure and didn't know how to run a country. It was members of the Second Continental Congress, and it was basically, they were saying like it was like the last attempt to find peace between Great Britain and the colonial people. The king, you can say he just put it to the side. He didn't care anymore about it. So since he regarded the petition, and because in the document itself, they were protesting on the new harsh taxes that they had. So in the end, the colonial people were like, okay, they didn't come to an agreement, so they had to take matters in their own hands, which led to the American Revolutionary War. Okay, thank you.